let's move on. This is also some very important piece of news. Again, with, something floating around in the background that could, explode into a major conflagration. So we had some breaking news last night that we didn't have an element for, but let me go ahead and read it to you. President Biden is weighing deploying thousands of troops to Eastern Europe and to the Baltics. The president is considering deploying warships and aircraft to NATO allies in what would be a major shift from its restrained stance on Ukraine. Biden is considering deploying thousands of U.S. troops, aircraft, NATO allies in the Baltics and Eastern Europe in an expansion of U.S. military involvement amid mounting fears of a Russian incursion into Ukraine. Now, as they point out here, it would be a major pivot for the Biden administration, which has specifically not taken this tactic ahead of any move by Putin at the fear of escalation. And actually, this is part of the problem that we have in this entire thing, which is that I have noticed it is tremendously difficult for many Americans to not put themselves in the minds of the other person. And I think that this is the single most important thing when you're considering international affairs, because you're like, oh, Putin is being a bully, etc. I don't even disagree with any of that. You have to try and understand what exactly this paranoia, fear, and aggression has come from, which is we said we would not expand NATO into Ukraine and the Baltic states. Yeah. And we promptly expanded NATO into the Baltic states, and we invited Ukraine and said specifically that we intend for Ukraine and Georgia in order to enter NATO, which is what triggered that 2008 incursion of Russia into Georgia, right? We said we wouldn't do it. Then we did it, and we basically triggered not only the rise of Putin and the, kind of revanchist Russian foreign policy by validating their worst concerns about the West and the fall of the Soviet Union. So that is driving their concern. Now, on our side, we seem to have an inability of understanding why exactly expansion of the U.S. nuclear umbrella all the way up to the borders of the Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union, and now currently Russia, would make them paranoid. And it especially does not help whenever we do and consider and float options like this. These are major things up the escalatory ladder. Now, in terms of what the rest of the Western world is doing, it's actually totally split. And that's part of the issue. The continent itself that we're supposed to defend, Krystal, can't really agree on what they want. So the Brits are very much out in front of this. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. The British say that Moscow is plotting to install a pro-Russian leader in Ukraine, a member of the Ukrainian parliament, somebody who has long agreed with Putin. People should also remember Ukraine was once part of the USSR. There is a large Russified part of their population who speaks Russian, identify as ethnically Russian. It's not as clear-cut as, we might make it seem. But the biggest concern here around the escalation ladder on the U.S. side, both the Biden option, but also current Secretary of State Anthony Blinken interviewed on CNN over the weekend, where he keeps the door open for direct U.S. military involvement. Let's take a listen.
Do you see any scenario in which more U.S. service members become involved here?
One of the things that we've been very clear about, besides the massive economic, financial consequences that would befall Russia if it further commits aggression against Ukraine, is the ongoing, continued buildup of defense capacity in Ukraine, and equally continuing to build up NATO's defensive capacities, including on the so-called eastern flank, the countries near Russia. And the alliance is looking at very practical and important measures that it would take in the event of further Russian aggression.
So there you go, Krystal, opening the doors to thousands of U.S. troops. Now it's being floated in the New York Times. It's very much a possibility, and it would almost certainly escalate tensions within the region.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. You could see how this could quickly spiral. Because, the Biden administration is thinking of this as like, okay, well, if he's going to invade in some way, we are going to do what he does not want us to do, which is to place more troops in the region closer to them. But you can see how that significantly escalates the tension. Then what do they do in response?
Then they go in.
Right, and then what are we forced to do? Because we've got all this tough talk now. They're going to pay, and we're not going to let it happen, and all of these things. So where does it end? And that's the thing that is, very uncomfortable. And look, let's be clear. The only people who really are interested in some sort of boots on the ground in Ukraine from a U.S. perspective are all within 30 miles of where we sit right now. This is not something the American people are interested in. And to your point, we're way beyond where anyone in Europe really is at this point in terms of how aggressive they want to be here. Even the UK. So the other sort of like big show that the Biden administration has made is removing some of the families of diplomats at the Ukrainian embassy. The Europeans are out front saying, we don't need, this is too alarming.
The Ukrainians were like, hey, this is crazy.
Right, exactly.
They came out last night and they were like, why did you do that? Yeah,
exactly right. They said that U.S. move to withdraw diplomats' families was premature. The EU is not following the U.S. in withdrawing its diplomats. Top European diplomat Josep Borrell says there is no need to dramatize the situation while talks with Russia continue. So there's a lot of my read of this is Biden made his very bumbling comments at the presser last week, which I actually kind of liked because he was like, if Russia does a little bit of an invasion, we'll see what we do with this. But there was such tremendous backlash from the Beltway media of how can you say that? You've greenlit an invasion. Now it seems to me that they are going over the top to signal, no, we're really tough and we really mean it and we'll go to war if we need to and we're going to take out the diplomats' families and all of that stuff. That seems to be what is really happening right now. With regards to the UK, the other thing you have to think of in terms of their own domestic political considerations is UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is in real trouble. A lot of trouble right now. Tons of scandals there in terms of, they had these lockdown measures. Typical hypocrisy. Meanwhile, he's having people over for drinks every Friday, which also classic Boris Johnson.
I support that, Boris, but I just wish he'd let everybody else do it.
Exactly. You're going to do it. You got to let everybody do it. So anyway, he's in a lot of trouble. So the other sort of political consideration is, are they floating this and also turning up the heat and the pressure to sort of distract from what's going on from him domestic? I mean, this is a typical play that world leaders have long pursued of when they're in domestic trouble, you can use some sort of shiny foreign object and conflict to distract from that and take the pressure off of yourself. That could be what's going on there with the Brits.
The other thing is, and remember, we have to consider this, which is that the argument for getting as involved as possible here would be, we have to defend the integrity of continental Europe. Here's the problem. The continental Europeans don't really agree. In fact, the Germans right now are blocking other NATO allies from providing lethal aid to Ukraine. Why? Because they want Russian gas, and for some idiotic reason, they have turned away from nuclear power, making themselves even more dependent on that state. They are, without question, the largest continental European power within both a military and economic perspective in the NATO alliance. So whenever that is the case, and they themselves don't want to get involved, you also should consider the domestic populations of the actual European nations. Put this up there on the screen, which is that go ahead and take a look at recent polling data from actual NATO countries. 53% of the French oppose going to war if a fellow NATO member is attacked. So not even Ukraine. 60% of Germans likewise. And as Sohrab Ahmari points out, Ukraine is not even a member of the NATO alliance. So they don't have Article 5 protection. Now, look, is it true that the West did engage in some promises with Ukraine in terms of not necessarily guaranteeing their security, but saying that if they gave up nuclear weapons, that they would have some sort of listen, like your sanctions and all of that, I think is fine, or at the very least, like some sort of backlash by the continental European powers. I think wars of territorial conquest are absolutely bad. But increasing thousands of U.S. troops into Europe, and again, for a country of which there is no strategic benefit, and I don't like to talk this way, but look, this is geopolitics. Ukraine is in the Russian sphere of influence. It has been for 500 years. It was part of the USSR. As recently, 1953 or whatever, it was part of that country. It's been part of the greater Russian Empire for on and off for a long time. In terms of its economic relations with the United States, not really that big. It's not like they ship us anything in particular. They have much more of an interest, the Russians do, in terms of keeping it inside their influence than we do. We have nothing majorly strategic at stake here. So it doesn't make a lot of sense in order to risk nuclear war. And I think that is the terms of which we should discuss. This is real life. This is not a joke. And this First World War and the escalatory ladders of not understanding where the other side is coming from, the other point here I would make is there's a lot of saber rattling in DC about, we got to make sure that, we appear tough. It's like, to what end?
Right.
To what
end?
Where
does that lead? And
where does that end?
I actually think Biden's comments, the ones that sort of fell out of his mouth and everybody jumped on him for at the press, that probably is where he actually is. That he doesn't really want to do anything too crazy. If Russian does just the tip kind of invasion, then he does. But we've seen before the way that commander-in-chiefs get pulled into this. Yeah. We've seen the incredible powers of manipulation of, sorry to use the term, the deep state here in Washington. And I think that's exactly the process that is playing out right now. They pull you in. They say, you gotta appear tough. Of course, we're not gonna actually do it, but you gotta say you're gonna send the troops in. You gotta pull the diplomats' families out. You gotta ratchet up the pressure. You have to make them understand that you're gonna be tough. Well, once you've said all of those things and you've gone out on that limb, then what? And that's how presidents get pulled into conflicts. As you said, this is incredibly dangerous. Two nuclear powers butting head in this old school throwback Cold War kind of way. Why in the world would we care more about policing Europe's borders than the Europeans do?
Yeah, they don't care.
I mean,
that's their problem.
That's ultimately what it comes down to. And that's the op-ed you were talking about.
Yeah.
So is it really that crazy for Biden and for the American people to groan at a supposed duty to police Europe's borders when Europeans have been this indifferent this long? No, it is actually the height of sanity. So again, all of these rhetorical feints, even if they are meant just to be rhetorical feints, they get you out on a limb where then you look like a fool if you don't follow through. And then what does Putin do? And then they again tell you, President Biden, you're gonna look like a fool if you don't also respond to this aggression. And by the way, we've just gotten out of Afghanistan, so the hawks are itching for some other conflict to pull the American people into. And that's what we're seeing play out right now. Of course, they've already sent lethal aid to Ukraine. This is the U.S. Embassy tweeted this out, showing off the first Biden lethal aid shipments to arrive. This came in very quickly. In total, Washington has issued over $2.7 billion in what they call defensive aid, going back to 2014, with the latest commitment of $650 million more being pledged last year. So, they're, again, saber rattling, showing how tough they are, showing how serious they are. We also covered last week how the CIA has been training a potential insurgency for years now, started under Obama, amped up under Trump, ramped up even further under Biden. So this is the type of dangerous situation that we are facing right now. Never forget, the media has no interest in telling you. They want you just to think Putin is this just operating from pure evil, that they have no national interest. They never want to explain to you the perspective of U.S. adversaries. And that's not even to justify that person or say it's fine, it's good, whatever. Yeah. But if you want to be serious about thinking through these issues, you have to understand the way that your opponents are also thinking through this issue. And that is where the U.S. media is just total propaganda, and effectively by leaving that side out of the equation is effectively lying to you about what is really going on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know any network out there that will tell you that George Kennan, the father of containment, who invented the entire Cold War strategy against the Russians, predicted that NATO expansion into the Baltic areas, into Eastern Europe, would trigger another conflict with Russia, and was rubbing it in the face of the fall of the Soviet Union, and would lead to the rise of revanchist, very paranoid people within Russia, aka Putin and the people around him. Putin has said that the fall of the Soviet Union, I think, is like the greatest human tragedy that ever occurred. I mean, you have to understand the mindset of which that they were raised in. And you also have to understand of greater Russian history. They have always viewed continental defense in depth, and by that I mean other people. And I know it's difficult to talk about this because there are real lives at stake. If you're Ukrainian, I'm sorry. I don't think it's fair that you get used as pawns in a great continental game. But that's how great geopolitics works. Russia is a nuclear power. That's how they view both the Baltic states and Ukraine. They see it as much more of a stronger security interest, both in terms of being able to remind the globe that they are still a global player with nukes that can influence global events, and also saying, hey, don't get any big ideas. You think you can't come over here and just, continue to expand in our neighborhood and just pay zero price for it. So the history of U.S. policy post the fall of the Cold War has made it so that, look, we intervened in Kosovo in the traditional, USSR sphere of influence. We expanded NATO. We invited Ukraine and Georgia into the NATO alliance. I mean, this was seen with there was no controversy about that in Washington.
Yeah.
Zero.
Right.
Everybody here was like, oh yeah, it's the best thing ever. Rubber stamp. Boom. Russia, go ahead, invades Georgia. It was like a slap in the face of history returning. And I think that people need to understand that history did not begin in 1991. It's been going on for a long time.
The last thing I want to say here in terms of how totally psychotic some of the people who are treated very seriously here in this town are when it comes to these sorts of issues. In that same New York Times article where they're talking about, all right, Biden's weighing sending thousands more troops, they say another former top Pentagon official for Russia policy, Jim Townsend, said that even that proposal didn't go far enough. Quote, "It's too little too late to deter Putin," Mr. Townsend said in an email. "If the Russians do invade Ukraine in a few weeks, those 5,000 should just be a down payment for a much larger U.S. and allied force presence. Quote, Western Europe should once again be an armed camp."
Yeah.
That's the people who are being taken seriously on this. That's the sort of things that they're thinking. Even these thousands of troops escalation that Biden is contemplating, that's not enough, that, if Putin invades, then we're going to have to do way more than that. Western Europe should once again be an armed camp. Those are the sorts of words and thoughts and ideological direction that should absolutely terrify you.
That's nuts. Sorry, one last thing. You guys will remember Alexander Vindman, the heroic colonel who sparked Ukraine-gate and all of that. This guy has been all over cable news the last 24 hours, where he has been pronouncing, quote, war is coming to Europe. He says that the U.S. is going to get involved whether they like it or not. Literally, war is coming to Europe. The U.S. was sucked into the European wars twice. Here is my new op-ed on how we mitigate the risks to U.S. national security. He is all but saying that war is inevitable on the continent. That's news to the Europeans, but these are the people who were elevated to the worst, highest parts and heroically made amongst the Democratic base and amongst MSNBC and all these people who take their word as gospel. He stood up to the big bad Trump, and now this nutcase wants us to have a full-blown war on the European continent with Russia over Ukraine. That was not even a possibility in the U.S. at the height of the Cold War. In 1952, if you had said, yeah, we're going to go to war over Ukraine, Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles and all those would have been like, are you nuts? That's part of the USSR. And yet, here we are, 2022, and it's somehow gotten even crazier. What a world.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.